Hi, everyone. Just to give you an idea of the format, we're going to be looking at different works in the room. So that does mean that we're going to be adjusting maybe around every 10 minutes. So get comfortable, but not too comfortable. We have stools in the back for anybody that wants, and we also have full chairs outside if you're more comfortable with that or if you change your mind along the way. I'm just going to get started, and we've woven in an introduction in the text. So we're going to start looking at this work here that we're projected on. The work is an 8-minute loop depicting television deflections and distortions, as shown on what is known as the Indian head test pattern. This was a drawing made to calibrate televisions that was introduced in 1939, and by 1947 would be shown on every American television. In the days when there wasn't 24-hour cable programming, the image would appear after television stations signed off for the evening and often play after the national anthem. Here, the image appears in silence as it would so that you could turn your dials and adjust the image so what would be transmitted would have the least deflections and distortions. Before the introduction of color televisions, a tiny version of this Indian test head pattern image was actually located inside every television. So at the end of a monoscope tube, which is a steel shielded vacuum glass tube, there would be a tiny version of this image. So that when you would see this image on your television console, you would be reflecting something that was actually inside of it. So here what we're looking at in the loop is a morph from one deflection and distortion to another, and there are subtitles describing those deflections and distortions in Portuguese, and the subtitles are strategically placed. There's also a text that goes along with the video work. The text has also suffered a few deflections and distortions, as each version of the text is unique. It was Xeroxed here. So the versions of the texts are each also a copy of themselves. There's 2 texts that you can read. You can take one with you as you leave today. And they're reflections on the Indian test head pattern that you see, and also the term índio, which is the Portuguese translation of the word Indian. Versions of this word are used all along the Americas, North and South America, and the text is a reflection on that. So this is my work, and when I was invited by Renee to exhibit here in Cleveland, I thought about the term, I thought about the local baseball team, I thought about the Midwest. I thought about how symbols get locked into being icons and meditating on if there can be a reversal of that process, a release. So I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about who we are, and that's me, Pedro, and Nolan, and what our relationship is to each other and to this room. So we work as the Index Literacy Program. The Index Literacy Program starts from an understanding that the index renders most existing knowledge infrastructures operational. We recognize it as a primary instrument of world making, and the world it makes possible is fixed as a set of relations, however permanent or impermanent. The power of the index is predicated on the belief that through information created in the past, we can structure the future. We've been working as the Index Literacy Program for 5 years. Our geographic reality is that we are most often than not apart. Nolan works from South Africa, which is where he's tuning in from today. Pedro is usually in Brazil, and we're very lucky that we have him here with us today. And I am usually in New York. We all met studying with Renee Green at MIT in Massachusetts, which may also be one of the reasons that a lot of our research actually resembles educational forms. So we're really glad that you guys are here with us today. We often set up workshops where we can have discussions about these topics that we're thinking about. And we will be having a discussion at the end of our presentation today. So by invitation from Renee Green, the Index Literacy Program was responsible for the arrangement of the works in this room, and Flock, which is a new site-specific work by the Index Literacy Program, which includes the frieze that you see along the top of the room, and the birds and the branches. You've just heard about my work, and like I said, we're going to talk about each of the works in the room, so that's why we're going to be moving around. We'll be shifting our focus, pointing at different elements, and leaving time for your questions and a group discussion at the end. Calling this a literacy program is based on fostering a sensitivity more than an expertise, creating an environment for attentiveness or recognition, approaching indexicality through suspicion. The index literacy program is about the legibility of the limitations of the index, being able to read the index in parallel to its limitations and consequences. So if at any point in time today you feel maybe a little bit confused about what we're saying, more often than not, we start looking at things as indexes, and we kind of invite you to go on that journey with us today.
So we've been working on a book, and we've been inviting people from a range of different disciplines to write around the theme of the index, to help us address its multiplicity of definitions and operative qualities, and beyond everything else, its fundamental importance in contemporary life. We want to quote a few definitions that we sourced from different contributions to the book that will help us move closer to a common vocabulary around the subject for today. Josephine Livingstone is a writer, journalist, and medievalist who says,
"The finger a person uses to point at things is their index finger. By extension, in its modern English usage, the noun index can refer to anything which points out, an informer, a list of forbidden books, a pointing device, and since the late 16th century, an alphabetical list of a book's topics printed on its final pages. Index implies the cold efficiency of the computer-generated appendix, but every piece of index data is a tiny mirror of the first time a human being unfurled their digit, cast it in a certain direction, and translated their thoughts into a sign. There's no kind of communication more basic. No further the matter of language can be boiled down. The cold timber of scientific language exists in antithetical relation to hot human flesh."
So when we're talking about the index within our project, we're thinking of a very broad spectrum that runs from the index finger to the computer-generated list, as Josephine says. The information organization tools that are somehow related to this very basic act of pointing and all of the abstractions that come forth from this act. And these examples can include all sorts of classificatory systems, such as library cards, databases, spreadsheets, back-of-book indexes, collection management tools, institutional documentation, email inboxes, all the way to biological taxonomies, climate models, ice cores, etc. And we're interested in basically anything that can have the purpose of organizing and giving access to and through information, and simultaneously enforce specific forms of control.
Hi everyone. We're trying to work towards a kind of anti-didactic literacy, an approach to indexicality, which is more about looking at the world and being able to identify things that have this function, that act in this way of organizing information. So we're aiming at a kind of agency that's built on recognition rather than definition. And to return to the point of pointing, Kwasu Tembu, who is a writer and media theorist based in Accra, who is also a contributor to our upcoming book, says this: "To index is to point to and or to point out, to refer to or to defer to, and to show. It is also to turn away from, to omit, and to hide. With indexicality, it is just as much a valid question what this or that index does not point out, does not show, does not refer to, as much as what it does. An index is a declaration of what isn't in what it declares itself to be."
So these works are mine, and I'm not entirely sure yet if they're two works that are combined into one part or one work that has been divided into two things. But in any case, they try to articulate some of the questions that emerge from these definitions that we're using. And both function by bringing into view parts of the documental materiality of the particular institution that we're in order to bring into view some of the indexical practices that are in place at the context we're situated in this case, moCa Cleveland. I want to talk about them a little bit, but this is not like an explanation of the work. I just want to kind of interpret them, grounding it in what's going on Kwasu's point on the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, focus and obfuscation, visibility and invisibility that are all contained in the act of indexing. So this first work, as you can see, is a video loop. But what might be a little bit less noticeable is that the projector from which the video is being shown is sitting atop a pile of documents. And these documents have all been discarded by moCa during the production period of this exhibition. There are printouts of emails, lists of works, notes, extra copies of contracts, things like that. And so what that means is that the work's physically sustained by discarded materials from the museum's offices. That is, all the artifacts, or not all of the artifacts, but some of the artifacts that have slipped the cracks of institutional order. They have fled indexication, and in this process, they have created a window into what is supposed to be archived and what is understood as maybe superfluous. It's a sort of index of absence. And similarly, the other work in view starts by looking at the museum's archives with an initial question of what does a non-collecting institution collect, and which are the indexing practices that are in place in its day-to-day operations. So the work's composed of 2 slides coming from non-catalog duplicates, which document past activities of the museum. And these slides, which are normally out of public view, are displayed here according to a protocol that involves the working schedule of 2 of the museum's engagement guides. Each slide is under the responsibility of one specific guide who's tasked with inserting it on the slide viewers as soon as they arrive at the museum for work. And then they take it with them again when they're leaving the institution. And they're keeping it in their possession at all times. So the 2 guides are part-time employees and they have flexible hours that are often unmatched. So this determines a kind of choreography for the piece, which at different moments can be either entirely visible or partially visible or not visible at all. And these modes of visibility are all indexed in function of the labor of these museum workers. So beyond establishing new and specific relations of care between the workers and parts of the institution, this index of presence also points to how labor is indexically regulated, not only here but in other places as well, and how certain architectures of occlusion are employed to promote or demote visibility of parts of a structure. We're going to move a little bit again.
And now we move.
The power of the index is predicated on the belief that through information created in the past, we can structure the future. This referential function is mediated by a set of indicators which produce conventional relations in time and in space. We refer to such power as an indexical attitude, a posture which can be adopted by both objects and subjects in service of a particular set of fixed or fixable relations. This indexical attitude, that an object may point to another in such a way that it can provide access to the latter as information, has shaped globalized culture from politics to colonialism, to entertainment, to surveillance, to artificial intelligence. And by looking at the index in isolation, we can question its abilities and its limitations as a primary bridge between forms of knowing, knowledge, and knowledge production.
The works that you're looking at are by Jessica Sarah Rinland. Jessica is an artist and a filmmaker. She's also a friend of ours and a former student of Renee's, maybe also a friend of Renee's. This selection of works, what Jessica calls fragments from the project, are documentation and resulting objects of a process of replicating an elephant tusk. This elephant tusk was originally collected in Malawi, a country in southern Africa, in 1900, so I guess 122 years ago, and is currently part of the collection of the Natural History Museum in London. This process and meditations on this process are documented in her film, Those That at a Distance Resemble Another, which will screen in Cleveland on December 20th. So yeah, if you can, I suggest you see it just before Christmas. The work seen here titled 0.11.18.4.H.0AX.19/2 is a ceramic tusk that is the end result of a process of negotiating access to the original elephant tusk housed in the Natural History Museum in London, 3D scanning that tusk, making a 3D model and 3D print of that 3D model of the tusk, and making a mold of the 3D print to ultimately replicate the original tusk in ceramic. It's like really complex. Within this choreography of production, the title of the work also points to an exploration of these complexities, the complexities of institutional organization systems. So 0.11.18.4.H.0AX.19/2 mirrors an accession number, but is also a cipher for the word hoax, HOAX, H.0AX.19/2. We can also see in the X-ray image hanging on the wall that inside the tusk is a seed of the Jarina plant. This seed of a plant found in the Amazon region has been identified as an excellent stand-in for ivory. Although it is not ivory, it shares certain qualities and performs functionally as ivory in a world where access to ivory is limited for good reason, obviously. So for conservators, particularly those working in the Natural History Museum in London, the Jarina seed is a kind of ideal replacement. It's kind of like an arrow pointed, like a pointed arrow, let's say, super sharp, aimed at something that it is precisely not. These two natural materials, ivory and plant seed, are on, let's say, a biological level, extremely disparate. But from a physical material perspective, they're significantly similar. One of the things about this work that resonates with our index literacy program is how it reveals the material tensions at play between systems of connection, which can be organized on, for example, utilitarian terms versus systems of connections which can be organized on biological terms. In this instance, there's a tension between the Jarina seed as a material index of ivory and the ceramic tusk as a tactile index of the same object. This tension mirrors in some way the history of taxonomy, which also registers changes in organizing principles based on between organisms and different methods of classifying life, which carry embedded in them technological and cultural, historical and political contexts. Yeah. I think it's time to move. Or maybe just move out.
You're the only one moving, actually.
So now we're going to look at the, you don't have to, maybe just your heads. We're going to look at the text at the top of the wall. to become again this species of birds, of which only one individual exists in the world, and which, when decrepit, arises from its pyre, made of aromatic plants, is said fabulously to become again young, to undergo happy former periods of life. In reality, it is the date palm, C.P. dactylifera, undergoing happy former periods of life to become again. This species of birds, of which only one individual exists in the world, and which, when decrepit, arises from its pyre, made of aromatic plants, is said fabulously to become young again, to undergo happy former periods of life. In reality, it is the date palm, C.P. dactylifera, undergoing happy former periods of life to become again, until it finishes. This text is a lightly edited version of an entry from Linnaeus's Systema Naturae, published in 1735, from the section titled Paradoxa. This publication is the first formalized scientific or natural philosophic taxonomy, an attempt to systematically account for all known life. This troublesome ambition meant the system had to register even the things it could not account for. And so we have the Paradoxa, Linnaeus's category for that which at the time was considered otherwise mystical, suspicious, and uncategorized. Phoenix, Hydra, Rana Pisces, now commonly known as the paradoxical frog, unicorn, pelican, satyr, Scythian lamb, the Scottish goose, also known as barnacle, dragon, the Automa mortis, also known as the death watch beetle, manticore, antelope, lamia, which is a child-eating monster, and the siren. The frieze text is a looped version of the entry on the phoenix.
Linnaeus' taxonomy is the first attempt to create rational relationships between things. However, these connections are not necessarily being discovered in the world as much as they're being invented, which necessarily embeds contextual views and biases within the system. In this case, those of a man living in 18th century Sweden. That doesn't necessarily mean that the system is right or wrong per se, but that the indexical relations stipulated are always a product of these, and honestly other, limitations. So the system always also indexes its context, and it points towards the structures that enabled it in the first place. Linnaeus' taxonomy is still the basis of much of what is taught about the natural world, but superimposed onto that system today is what is reviewed by genomes. Genomic models, or in our case, relating birds to other birds that share genetic material, have not reinforced relations based on physical resemblance as we could see in Linnaeus' table, or later vertical inheritance, as it is apparent in Darwin's phylogenetic tree, but instead it reveals something else. And here we're quoting a biologist called Alexander Su, who wrote that not a tidy series of diverging branches, but a kind of web or fishnet, whose contours constantly crossed paths. In 2016, Su urged his colleagues to consider other patterns of evolution, to argue less about which species tree is correct and more about if there is such a thing in the first place, as a traditional tree of life for modern birds or for other kinds of animals. So a natural tree can be infinitely complex, but our drawing or our model of it cannot. And our indexical tracing of all relations contained within that, even less so. So the index is always an insufficient account of relation, an architecture of constraint and enablement. Is your view good? No?
Yeah.
I think we're good.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this peculiar choreography. We had an idea of what it would be like, but it's, at least for me, really surprising to see this in action. At the moment, it amounts to me looking at a screen with my own face on it, and talking to a crowd that I can't see at all. So yeah, I think we're all together in the peculiarity of this situation. I'm going to talk about. I have a list here that says other object indexes in natural sciences, stratograms, rock cores, trees, and lies to children. We'll see how far we get with that list. But I'll start with object indexes. And I think the branching tree that Pedro just spoke about is a good example of an object which is also a model and an organizational logic. In this specific case, it's the indexical structure used to organize phylogenetics, but the branching tree, also called the logic tree or the issue tree, is a kind of general indexical form. We could place this idea of the tree and the branch alongside the list and the table and the pile as kind of quintessential organizational tools of the information era. The tree, or trees in general, are also examples of another category of indexicality, what we've been calling object indexes, but what the Czech philosopher Lukáš Likovan refers to as orthographic phenomena. These are objects or systems capable of self-representation in indexical systems, or objects or systems that generate for themselves some kind of indexical system. So in the case of the tree, the branch is an index of a relationship to the trunk. Each branch represents a sequence of subdivision, a kind of hierarchy of splitting, so we know not only that there is a fork, but which fork was first and which was second, and so on. Trees are kind of doubly orthographic. The rings of trees offer us another form of the self-indexicality. Through their cycles of growth, trees register not only the facts of their own existence, but also serve as proxies for other environmental data. They catalog data about atmospheric composition, historical events such as fires and floods, prevailing wind strength and direction, etc. Alongside trees, we can count rocks and earth cores and ice cores and fossils and holes and DNA sequences, scar tissue, star patterns, background radiation, etc., as pieces of the world which are, on the one hand, indexically isomorphic, which basically just means they point to themselves in a deep and complicated way. They kind of render themselves as data and provide access to themselves as data. And on the other hand, they're kind of indexically exomorphic. They index information external to themselves. They point away from themselves, enabling us to access information about other aspects of the world, but through them. This multi-indexicality is a really important quality of what we call an indexical attitude. And when I say we, I mean the index or our index literacy program. Multi-indexicality suggests that indexes are capable of indicating more than they seem. Object indexes highlight how changes in our modes of knowing, our technological capabilities, and our political orientations reveal latent indexical connections kind of beyond the horizon of our classificatory systems. They allow us to know the world differently. I think the question for us and for me in my own personal work is, how can we be more sensitive to these indexical flows? The work that that we're looking at here is called Hositile's Folly. It's a Black Liberation Zodiac excerpt. It's the second one. And it's part of a series of works concerned with the night sky. There's a lot to talk about, but I think there's one really important thing to know about the sky, to kind of engage with the series. And it's basically that due to the geometry of the globe and the axis of rotation, there are two night skies. There's the sky that you all will see later tonight in the northern hemisphere, and there's the sky that I see outside of my window right now in the southern hemisphere. There are things that I can see that you will never see unless maybe you visit us here in the southern hemisphere. And the same is true for me in relation to you. However, when you're along the same latitude, you do share a sky. So for example, Cleveland and Beijing and Sardinia are all somehow around the 41st parallel north. And through the course of the night, have access to more or less the same night sky. The really important thing to remember here, or that I'd like you to remember here, is that there is a real difference. I'd also like to think about the sky as a kind of orthographic pattern, or I'd like you to think about the sky as an orthographic pattern. And in a sense, the distribution of stars in the sky has for a long time been our most reliable index for seasonal and cyclical change, our most reliable long-distance navigation system, our most reliable archival system. And nighttime cultures everywhere use the stars. I mean, I probably can't say everywhere, but I think you'll allow me. But nighttime cultures use the stars as a narrative index. Each group of stars, each pattern, so to speak, each constellation is aligned to an image, each image aligned to a story, and each story to a conception of ourselves. And this series of works, this particular work, is really trying to think through the kinds of stories that we index, or that we allow the night sky to index. This work is based on a very simple intuition. The night sky is governed by an agency, a UN agency called the International Astronomical Union. The International Astronomical Union designates the celestial coordinate system based on constellations drawn from the history of European and Eurasian mythology. And that basically means that the scientific project of mapping the sky is also a cultural project, and from my position, a particularly colonial project. And the last intuition is that there are other possibilities. The sky is always bigger than the systems we use to discipline it, and through it ourselves. And the sky does not necessarily have to, and has not always been, an oppositional force. It can be an ally in the indexing of other histories. So for this work, named after the South African poet Kearapetsi Kgositsile, who spent a lot of his life in the US and forms a conceptual link between the Black art movement of the 1960s and 70s in the US and the Black consciousness movement of South Africa. We try here to think about this very peculiar link between the abolitionist movement and this image that's there on the bottom of a man, an enslaved person in chains, looking up, who knows at what. hands in chain, and this image on the top left corner, which is the logo of the Black Consciousness Party, 1970s anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which are two fists with a broken chain, the chain broken by a star. And I think I'm going to stop talking there because I can't really tell what's happening in the room. But I appreciate that there is enough. I've said enough to give you some way in to this work. I'll maybe end by saying something. Khositsile, the poet, gives us this concept of the past, present, future, which is one word, and it's a kind of epiphenomenal time in which the past and the future are always now. And I think it's a useful way to reflect on what both Laura and Pedro said about the index kind of functioning through this belief that information created in the past can structure the future, which itself functions in a particular kind of temporal, linear temporal imaginary. And that perhaps if we approach indexicality from a different direction, maybe a different temporal attitude, this secret function of control and discipline that the index tends to have might open to something else. I'm supposed to say something about educational aesthetics, and they are really important modes of thinking and working for us. I think it's apparent, I think even in this presentation, that we have a certain commitment to forms of educational inquiry, the lecture, the journal, the workshop. But I also want to say that we take seriously the promise of study as a social form, study as a way of reorganizing relations and developing connections and involving ourselves in the world. So study, which is the place that the three of us met, also informs the way we try to think with others, that maybe this could be an invitation. And so I'll leave it there and hope that you can speak back.
Thank you, Nolan.
So now we don't really have a big conclusion. We're just gonna sort of fizzle out and hopefully fizzle into a conversation kind of seamlessly. But in order to just start getting things going, I wanted to pull one last quote from our future book, which comes from artist and writer Louisa Crosman's contribution. And she says that the index is a navigational tool in the sense that it can be seen as synthetic operation of creating markers of orientation, grouping, and reference, all of which must be constructed under a shareable politics in order to be effectively communicated and intelligible. And maybe to more conversationally start to get things going, I think it would be also interesting to go back to the point of pointing and this etymological origin of the term and the kind of gestural performative aspect of what we're proposing in the room, which is just the balancing of the birds. This kind of happened hapstance, I'd say, but we're very interested in the way that this gesture turned out to be, in the sense that it's sneakily obliging people who were balancing the birds to point at the text and create this kind of relationship between the two things. But at the same time, the angle of the hand that you need to balance the bird is quite different from that angle of pointing. So instead of being this arrow-like move of pointing, of accusing, of suggesting, it's got this sort of open palm kind of position embedded into it. So it becomes this kind of hybrid form of pointing towards, but also allowing an openness to retract or to receive.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to our point about trying to create a non-didactic research group, which maybe sounds funny, but we really like the openness of an upward-facing point. It just seems friendlier. And I think we should turn the camera now so Nolan can see the group, and we've all kind of gathered on this, seems like close enough to a circle. So we'd love to open it up to you guys for any questions or comments or anything you'd like to say. I'd love to try, if you want to speak, if you could balance the bird. But if that's too much to think about, we can, yeah, we don't have to respect that, but I thought we could try it. Does anybody want to say anything? The speaking bird.
Bird in one hand, the mic in another, because we're recording, so.
Yeah, I was sort of wondering how to think about absolute versus relative indexes, and can there be such a thing as an absolute index? Like, sort of, what is the kind of agreed upon language that we have when it comes to indices?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point, because I don't think we've actually thought about anything in those terms, but they're quite relevant, especially for like these totalizing, universalizing projects that are kind of a part of the history of the index. This kind of enlightenment notion of the absolute, maybe, or the possibility of the absolute. I have to think about this a little bit more, but the first thing that came to mind when you're asking the question is, so there's one passage of Borges that keeps recurring in our research, both in our initial research, when the first workshops that we did, but also a lot of the contributors have been using the same passage, which is in his short story, The Philosophical Language of John Wilkinson. I think that's the name, or something like that. He goes on to describe this Chinese encyclopedia and the categories by which these entries are classified. And instead of being the categories that we naturalize in the Western world as absolute to some extent, like the alphabet or disciplinary range or something, it's all based on what seems to us very incredibly arbitrary, like objects made with camel hair, things that look pretty from a distance, and it goes on with very amusing categories. And Foucault gets this quote to open his book, The Order of Things, and he says that he laughed a laugh that broke all classification everywhere in the world when he read that. So I think that's already like to some degree a form of looking into this notion of the absolute, or the possibility of indexing something absolutely. But then that got me thinking about another Borges work, which is a short story in which he describes the attempt at creating a map that is on a one-to-one scale to the thing that it's mapping. And there's obviously like a logical impossibility of doing that, but also this kind of infinite recurrent problem, which is now I have to map the map because it's part of the territory. And it just becomes life, right? At the end, it just becomes life. The very much the same way when he describes a library with all the books, that just becomes the universe. So an index that is absolute to some degree is just lived experience. It's not, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, well, We have a few people from MIT in the audience today, and so it's nice to be pressed as artists by people coming from the sciences usually. And I think this question of absolute is often asked in the sciences, and one of the reasons we actually settled on the birds as a metaphor that we would use in this room is because of a recent exercise that had happened in biology where there had been many attempts to map modern birds, so the entire tree of birds, and the way that that was done in the past was based on similarities of physical characteristics. And that, created a sort of tree that had been agreed upon by scientists, at least, to follow what is visible in terms of characteristics between birds. Now, with genomics and the ability to now, compare the genomes between birds, they said, okay, great, we're going to do that, and it's going to match up to this tree that we've drawn, and it's going to prove the absoluteness of what is a Darwinian idea of evolution through characteristics. And then what they found didn't match at all, right? It's a completely different tree. And it started this discussion, which is where the quote comes from, which is to say, is one of those trees more absolute than the other? Are either of them absolute at all? And so I think that that's kind of where we're coming from, which is to say, how do we acknowledge the fact of life, which is that indexes are necessary in order to process information, in order to read your emails. They're actually all indexed. Your inbox is an index, right, of a way in which you're processing that information. But how do we leave space to question those things? How do we leave space to what we call this suspicion of this? Because what we find is that it is a system of control, whether it's working for us or against us. So I think the question of the absolute is really what are your terms? And also there is something perhaps to be said slightly more absolute about a genomic similarity versus a characteristic similarity, but it's also kind of, that's the way we're reading the genomes now, but who knows how we're going to be reading them in some years' time. So I think we're really interested in the superimposition between things that are considered absolute. I don't know if that... I kind of want to sit. Do you want to sit?
So I'm going to bring my own bird, and just a minute I'll get the microphone for you. So I'm exploring space and time to ask my question. I have two index fingers. The human brain is organized quite differently in the left and the right hemisphere. That might actually affect...
Can I hold the mic for you if you want to hold
Sure.
the mic?
The bird can go away. So... As I was looking at these images, I was trying to see what hand was pointing, whether it's a left-handed or a right-handed person, or whether in the case of my bird, I'm indexing myself. Because I think the way we see the world with the left hand and the right hemisphere and the right hand and the left hemisphere is actually quite different. So I guess my question to you is, did you look at a left and right-handedness? Did you look at which hand was being used? And did you ever look at people that were pointing at themselves?
Thank you. The short answer is no. I didn't really think about this until now, and that's actually a very, very interesting way of looking at this work. And I'm left-handed, so that is a big part of my life just because of the kind of difference that is implied into that. But I think what I would say is that this idea of having two index fingers, well, first of all, I think one of the things we've talked about a lot during our kind of preparation for this was the kind of childhood saying of like whenever you point at someone, there are three fingers pointing back at you. So this idea of this being indexing itself is also contained in the pointing, the regular pointing, because once you're pointing at something, and that's kind of what we're trying to say about taxonomy too, you're not saying it, but you're always pointing at yourself back. You're always constructing your gesture based on a specific condition of gesturing. So, yeah, I'm still kind of, I have to think about the whole left-handedness and right-handedness of things.
I'm gonna keep grilling you. I think the other question that I think is interesting to me about this work is the 360 degree. Is there a, when I watch it, like there's an aspect of it that's also a kind of radial pointing. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, I think there are a few ways that I could talk about that. I think one very brief way is just because yesterday I was going through the exhibition and experiencing it kind of for the first time as well. We were talking about this because the last time we were here we were installing, so there was no time. And on the wavelengths apparatus, I'm going to call it, units, I was just there with Neil, and by chance Christian Markley just popped up in a conversation. Christian Markley is an artist who does a lot of sound work, and there's a lot of like circularity in his work because of records mostly, but he's got this very famous work called The Clock, which is a 24-hour work of film in which the film is always showing a clock that he extracted from some other film, showing the moment of day where the film, when the film is showing, if that's clear. So I don't know if that's... Yeah, exactly. So you're always looking at the screen and seeing what time it is based on this capture of another image. So that's something that was, oh yeah, thank you. I have to, because I'm left-handed, so I have to do this. But so I was thinking about that a lot when I was doing this. Like, what's the structure that I had all of these bunch of images that I had collected of pointing fingers, just because we were thinking about these things. And once it was time to kind of look at them and think, what are these supposed to be? This structure kind of emerged from Christian Markley to some degree. But I think there's like a kind of effect of that, which is this absence of the thing that is being pointed at becoming kind of substituted by the pointing itself. Yeah. So the pointers are always, it's kind of what you were saying, like the pointers are always pointing at pointing. And, or there is an absent object in the middle that we have to kind of envision, or something like this, I guess.
Yes. Bird first. Thank you. I thank you all for this incredible experience. I'm so glad I was able to make this. So I actually want to keep going on Pedra's piece, and I have a question about this idea of the indexical relationship with photography, right? Like that gets used so frequently, this idea of like an indexical relationship with an image. And because there's photographs, you know, the hand is primarily through, you know, perhaps there's some moving images, but most likely photographs, but they're suddenly stripped of their indexical quality to some degree because, you know, there is still a relationship between a particular time and place within these images, but the context is completely stripped away from it. And I was wondering if you could point to that, or just talk about that, not point to it, but talk, yeah, maybe, could you talk about that? There's been enough pointing today.
That's a really difficult question for me because, in all honesty, I've always had a lot of trouble with the text where this idea comes from, which is Rosalind Krauss, the indexical image. Is that the name of the text? Notes on the index, exactly. I've always really struggled with kind of really grasping what you were saying. And I think that's in part because I've got this, so when we started this project, we were talking about the index and we started really through this form, right? Like the indexical forms, the back of book index, the factory records index is something we referenced a lot at the beginning. And then we expanded and we expanded. But the index is very loaded with semiotics. So we could talk about the index in like the Peircean classification of sign, which can be divided in index, icon, and symbol. And we tried to avoid that, or I did for a long time, because I feel very insecure about that, like range of, knowledge. But it's kind of inevitable. And people started talking about this on the book, and then we had to kind of, confront it. But in that sense, I think, and Rosalind Krau's text is very indebted to, it's very indebted to this kind of semiotic thinking, right? But I think to be more, try to be more precise about what you're saying, this rupture with the context and this indexicality of photography is, I think, very much on the surface of what's happening, because in the end, you're bringing much more indexicality to the presence of the things that are not there. It's again like this play on visibility, I think. The sort of margins of context that you have, and it's not just because the images are cropped, but also like very fast-paced. You have to look at it and look at it and look at it to kind of create some kind of intimacy with what you're saying. It gives a lot of voice and a lot of power, I think, to what's not there. And it's funny because yesterday, one of the engagement guides, I was just talking to her, and she went, "Oh, we have kind of a game here that we just try to point to the moment when this image appears," which is from a meme.
I was just going to bring
Yeah.
It's the only relatable, it's the only
Exactly.
image that you can understand. Like,
Yeah, it's the housewives meme, the woman pointing at the cat, and so that, but that's also, it just popped up there. Yeah, so that was really, I loved hearing that, because that's what I mean. Like, they had to look at it a few times to first like acknowledge that it was there, but then it just becomes a massive thing, despite being cropped and being fast-paced and not like not being there. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just rambling now.
I'm the same person, so I get two questions. I'm in a different space, so I guess I'm so back to the comments about trees and genetics. I perform occasionally here as a tree doctor, so I speak from that perspective. We guys are hiding a lot from you. So this idea we have branches that was referred to in the video, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, and clear separations between one branch and the other. You have to look underneath at the entanglement, because there's actually a book on the entangled tree of life which looks at lateral connections between things. So I think if we eventually get to some understanding of that difference, it'll be epigenetics. It'll not be just the DNA, which is more linear. It'll be something that's a bit more complicated than that. So that wasn't intended as a question as much as an elaboration, if you wanted to continue that part of the conversation.
Could you hear that, Nolan? I just want to make sure Nolan can.
I didn't hear everything. I think I heard everything I heard just sounded great. Epigenetics, lateral connections, collaboration, and but I didn't hear everything. But it made me very happy to hear all of that. What I did get. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can respond to what I did hear, and you'll forgive me for misconstruing the meaning of your contribution. But I think I mean, we're also trying to think through like some of these kind of structural models for organizing knowledge, right? And the tree is such a critical kind of model for understanding certain relations, like relations of descent, you know, in Darwinian terms. But one of the things we were speaking about a lot was there is no like the tree. There is no singular tree. There are like there's the tree in the sense of this idealized set of relations, branching structure, but then there are like real trees, like a tree. And I think when we start thinking more closely aligned to what is actual, these models are completely troubled. And I think in that, in those moments, possibility emerges, and kind of maybe even deeper senses of understanding relations. So, and of course, I didn't fully hear your question or your contribution, but I do love this idea of the horizontal transfer, the horizontal gene transfer, the kind of, I don't know, like responsive mutation rather than like, and all of these ideas seem really, for me, much more, and even to maybe say something about the idea of the relative or absolute. I think these, in any case, would be ways of configuring a relation, to imagine a relation as absolute or imagine a relation as relative. I think is much more bound with power and the kind of thing that we want to become, or the thing that, or the way in which we want to relate to the world. So yeah, that's my contribution to a kind of misheard comment.
Yes.
Bird first.
You're a professional.
Yeah, I may be, but I don't know if I have. I don't know if I have this kind of balance for the multitasking. But anyway, this has been a very stimulating experience, and I'm just extremely happy to be able to be present for it. I'm not sure I can handle my thoughts in this finger. Could you please take this? Thank you. Partly because,
One thing at a time,
yeah, I know. I'm the slow thinker, putting things together, thinking about both index fingers, the left and the right, made me. Also, a lot of things are stimulated in this, and I don't have any conclusive response, but just I'm stimulated by some of the things that were said. And so I like the idea of the two-directional indexical pointing. It made me, I have associative paths of thinking. So I'm thinking about what Nolan was mentioning about the southern and northern hemispheres of the night sky. I like to think about these things. And then this idea of the lateral entanglement that's beneath the branches of the tree. I mean, that automatically, for me, think about something rhizomatic. I mean, part of the things that I've been hearing from what you all have been saying, I guess I sort of think about them in relation to different theoretical models that have been proposed that might seem inadequate. And I would agree about their inadequacy. Notes on the index, for example. Because when you encounter something that involves matter, and the materiality, as well as experiences, and mutations of different kinds that are unpredictable, other things emerge. And so this is something that I think is a very ripe and vast area for exploration. There are, I mean, also the question of the indexical and the photographic. These are things that are kind of continually fraught. I think about Henri Bergson in relation to matter and memory. And this has got a Deleuzian connection in terms of thinking about time and about matter and about what would be a memory. What's a memory? What's the difference between a memory and an image? What's photographed is not the same as a memory. And so that's an area it's still ripe for exploration. And I think it relates, as I was listening to people talking and also the reference to the mem and whatever, I have a lot of questions about images and how they affect us now and then how they become entangled in terms of what we imagine to be our memories. And so there are all of these things that you guys have raised. And I love looking at being in the room. I'm sorry you're not in the room, Nolan. The room looks so nice and spatially like being close, but it's at least great to see your projection on the wall in the room. So this, it's nice at the same time, at least. But yeah, a lot of things are being crossed in this room. And so we have the indications of the constellations and also this imaginary way of putting things together. So, I mean, so many things that we've been dealing with over the past even 48 hours, I would say, including with Sunil's presentation last night. When we think about montage, think about how things are put together. And then this notion that you were mentioning of the poet that you're referencing, Nolan, with the past, present, future as one word, super interesting and relevant, I think, for our continued thinking. So yeah, this is just a kind of like commentary, just riffing off of what is what's in the room, what's been said, and just feeling happy. Happy former periods of life, and present ones as well. So I turn it. Maybe I could balance the bird on my finger now.
You want to try?
Oh, well, I need a bird. Did we lose a bird? Bird out.
Almost.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
This is maybe to everyone, and it's something I've been thinking since the question around Pedro's work and context, and it's got to do with the relation between kind of indexical extraction and a sample. And I feel like Renee could speak beautifully about that, but I'm sure everyone in the room could speak about this. But this is something, that's on my mind a lot recently, and looking at these strange branches that come out of the wall, and there's this is a question for me, and of course, maybe related to a history of maybe two histories of sampling, like a kind of scientific wrapped up with colonial histories of sampling, and a more contemporary kind of hip hop, Black musical tradition attitude to like reuse and misuse and sampling. Like for me, those images in Pedro's video feel like samples, that's it.
I just want to piggyback, I think, on your question and sort of maybe more specifically point it to Renee a little bit. Because I think I agree that there's a lot of interest in this idea of like collecting and sampling, what are the relationships and what are the tensions. And also one thing that I think is very present in your work is this tension between indexing and accumulating, I think. So ever since we started thinking about the book and sort of discussing with you your participation in the book as well, I think this idea of the indexation of influence plays a big part in your trajectory. So the referential quality of the work and the kind of subjectivity that you lend the act of indexing sort of purposefully. The selected life indexes, for instance. And I think kind of like going along with what I understand Nolan is asking, I wanted to kind of think about that too. You know, like the kind of the polar relations between gathering, accumulating, sampling, indexing, maybe. I would like to.
Okay, thank you for raising that. Interesting. I guess as you were talking about that, I was thinking about accretion. I guess that's one of the things we've been talking about. And then also what was mentioned about a different form of study and how that might be considered. And I think of it as a very durational activity. And something that, when I think of past, present, future altogether, I think of that in relation to forms of relay. And so relay also can be considered in relationship to indexing or pointing. I mean, as I've been listening to you, I've been thinking about the ways that, for example, when I was working on trying to translate the physical import-export func office, a work that I made, which I've recently encountered physically because it's in Zurich. And I was there last Sunday taking a lot of photos and making notes about how to continue this work spatially and what it would require to be able to continue as a work in the collection of moCa in Los Angeles, because there's a certain deterioration that takes place with any kind of physical elements. And this has ephemera. For example, newspapers from the 1990s, 1992 in particular, of the Rodney King times of riots that were taking place in Los Angeles, or rebellions. And so when you can see how the matter is deteriorating, and then there's also a digital version of it that I made of this work, which was originally going to be a CD-ROM on the verge just before internet possibilities occurred. And we knew that working on it. I was working with computation people at the University of Lüneburg and developing it. And so there are these different strands of thinking about, okay, when having to translate it into a digital version of it, a certain kind of indexing was necessary in terms of trying to figure out what all the samples were, or what all the data was that was a part of it. And so the decision of how to decide, and this is related to what you mentioned earlier, Pedro, about, well, what is extraneous or what is retained. I mean, this is a constant question. And so this relates also to sampling, too. And it relates to editing, like a film also. You know, sort of like, how do you decide what is the material to keep or what do you discard? Because you have hours and hours and hours of footage, you know, or of recording. And so it's like this kind of it's almost scary decision-making process that takes place, but also one that you have to, you just accept that, okay, there's going to be a limit. There's not going to be everything included. What would be distilled? What do you want to distill in this? And that's also an aesthetic form, thinking about, well, how does that, and that has different kinds of, that's sort of visceral in terms of affect. What do you feel in your body? How does it resonate in different ways? And so I think about that in relationship to sound and to sampling, like in music, for example. And so there are still a lot of different things that are overlapping and intersecting, like in terms of forms of affect and the actual perceptions and the brain. Like, what is it in your body? You know, all of these different things like that are crossing. And I don't have any sort of expertise in designating those things, but they are recurring, and I think about them a lot. So that's about all I can say about that at this time. It's all underway, in process, in study.
I think just to respond to that, I think this idea of our memory and reflecting on our memory as a form of an index is a really nice open one. And like you were saying, memory not in the sense of just the things we remember, but trying to record the things we forget. And affect, like especially I find in your films, I think sometimes they're also striving to create mood, and mood is often created in things that maybe aren't the most articulated in our memories. And another thing I will just say, is a lot of your works, I won't recognize all the names, which might be something that some of the other visitors experience, but what I really find is that they're all doors. They're all like entryways or gateways into something. Like the banner downstairs happens to be a banner where I recognize more of the names. But yeah, just thinking about those compositions and those montages, and it's just been really so great to be able to make a site-specific work for this exhibition, and for us to be able to think about this mode with all of you guys today. Thank you for, I feel like the room wasn't complete until today in the sense of all your participation. So thank you, Nolan, so much for tuning in. I feel like we managed to make you feel like you're here with us. So I hope you had a good experience. Yeah. The only thing you're missing is a bird. I'm sad we didn't send you a bird, because that would have been... Oh, you have a bird. Oh, yes. Look at that.
So bird necklace.
A bird in the sky.
In solidarity.
That's beautiful. Okay, I think we got to leave it there. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, Corey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thanks, Renee.
And Renee. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Javier. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.